Okay, so Lewis Comfort Tiffany. So I'm starting off with my first slide here, which is a close-up of a Tiffany window. I am concentrating very much on glass. Tiffany was an interior decorator. He also made ceramics. I'm going to concentrate on the glass. It's like being asked to do William Morris in 1 hour. In fact, you can think of Lewis Comfort Tiffany as the William Morris of America, as he diversified into so many areas. And Art Nouveau front cover of the exhibition catalogue held at the V&A in 2000, which was celebrating the high points of Art Nouveau as it reached an apogee in the year 1900. And the front cover is a beautiful jewel by René Lalique. And you can see there the birth and death dates of Art Nouveau, 1890 to 1914. And below it is a magnificent vase that's known as the Heart of the Rose, which is by Émile Gallet, who was the leading Art Nouveau glass designer and maker in Europe. So he's like the equivalent of Tiffany in Europe in terms of being at the cutting edge, if you pardon the pun, of glass. Having said that, of course, there were other rivals in Europe, but these are what I refer to as the big three in terms of the development of glass at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. So Tiffany in America, René Lalique in France, and Émile Gallet was situated, or his workshops were situated in Nancy, which is the capital of Lorraine. And you might not have thought of, in fact, Lalique in terms of glass, but he was already using glass in his jewels. So Lalique was most famous for his jewellery at the height of the Art Nouveau period. He'll develop his glass really in the Art Deco era, which is 1919 to 1939. You can see Lalique down at the bottom there. He was also at the peak of his career, aged around 40 in 1900. At the top, we have a portrait of Émile Gallet, who sadly died prematurely of leukemia in 1904. And then on the far side, the rather handsome, as you can see, although here slightly older, Lewis Comfort Tiffany, born in 1848, a particularly propitious year, the year of revolution in Europe, which is going to be very important in terms of the history of the company of Tiffany. The year of revolution, 1848, as you'll see in a minute, enabled his father, Charles Tiffany, founder of the company Tiffany's, to buy a lot of diamonds. And I'm showing you a magnificent window. Now, I'm going to refer to them as stained glass, but they're not really stained glass in the traditional sense, i.e. medieval windows, because for the most part, Tiffany does not paint his windows with enamel, which is in itself a form of glass. He is going to be able to paint with the glass itself using all sorts of new technologies. And the important thing to remember about all three of my Art Nouveau masters of glass is they're not just brilliant designers, they are also brilliant in terms of new technologies. They're constantly inventing and innovating, and this is perhaps the reason why glass has never known a better period than the Art Nouveau era. It made such a huge contribution to the architecture. So if you're wondering what the strange thing in the center of your screen is, it's a gateway, the Porte Binet, which is the entrance to Paris 1900. And those strange bubbles all over it are electric lights. Because if there's one thing to really embody for me what Art Nouveau is all about, it is the advent of electric lighting. And obviously for both Gallet and for Tiffany, lamps will be a huge part of their production. So just to remind you, because many people get confused by the term L'Art Nouveau, it's named after a shop. The shop was opened, or gallery, by Siegfried or Samuel Bing in 1895 in the heart of Paris. It translates literally as the new art and was a break with everything that had gone before in terms of reviving historical styles. Bing and his troupe of artists, because he was very much again part of a collaboration, were all very keen on Japanese prints. So you can just see in the corner of the slide, it says Galerie d'Art Japonaise. So it was very easy for all of my artists to see Japanese prints. And if you've ever been to Monet's House and Garden, Giverny, you'll know that he collected over 200 Japanese prints. The trouble with Art Nouveau, and I've got a whole list, as you can see here, rather daunting, of countries and different names by which Art Nouveau was described at the time. Like all architectural and design styles, there's no definite birth and death date, but I always say it emerges around 1889 at the Paris Exposition of that year, and the war, 1914-1918, is its obvious death knell. In Belgium, it's also known as l'Art Nouveau. Obviously in France, l'Art Nouveau. So in all French-speaking countries, it's Art Nouveau or the New Art, with Hector Guimard, the leading protagonist in Paris, Émile Gallet in Nancy, and in Belgium, Brussels. If you've ever been there, you might have been to one of Victor Horta's houses. However, in the German-speaking areas, including Scandinavia, it's known as Jugendstil, or youth style, after a magazine launched in Munich in 1896. That's the front cover down the bottom. In Vienna, it's the Secession, led by Gustav Klimt in particular, and the Wiener Werkstätte under Hoffmann and Moser. Munich, Berlin, Budapest, and Prague, and even Riga, you'll often see it there described as Art Nouveau, sometimes Jugendstil, but more often Secession. There is no major Art Nouveau movement in London. That particular accolade goes to Glasgow with Mackintosh and his 4 collaborators. In Spain, it's Modernism or Modernista under Antonio Gaudí in Barcelona. And in America, undoubtedly, Lewis Comfort Tiffany is the most famous protagonist associated with Art Nouveau. But we can even study it in Italy as Liberty Style. It takes its name from the shop on Regent Street, opened by Arthur Lazenby Liberty in 1875. And again, very important because, again, Tiffany modelled his own career pattern on Arthur Lazenby Liberty. And finally, I'm probably exhausted by the list, in Portugal, it's known as Art Nouveau. And I do this to show you how far-flung Art Nouveau is. You might have encountered it without actually knowing it when you've been in Barcelona, and that it was always from the beginning, either you loved it or you hated it. So we've got a poster for l'Art Nouveau, Samuel Byng. He was the main agent for Tiffany in Europe, both the glass and the windows. And it did not go down well when he showed it in London at the Grafton Galleries at the opening of the 20th century. You can also see on the poster a factory. This is one of the big difference between Tiffany and Morris. Whereas Morris rather turned his back on factory production, Tiffany will embrace the latest technologies, and he will be much more democratic by using mass production techniques. He really will be able to achieve art for the people. I love this image of Tiffany at his home, Laurelton Hall on Long Island. Sadly, the house was destroyed in the 1950s. But this was another great discovery that we all made just a few years ago, because this is by Sorolla, the sort of master of Spanish light, which I think you'll agree is beautifully captured here. And it shows Tiffany painting with a profusion of flowers behind. Because if there's one motif that we can really pick out that dominates all of Tiffany's designs, it is indeed flowers. He's not going to be able to adapt to Art Deco. I think this was largely built within him, as he started out making windows in a style that you and I would actually call rather geometric, but he really did not like the Cubists and the Futurists and all the other avant-garde art movements coming out of Europe in the sort of like around about 1910. So he found it very difficult to adapt to Art Deco, which emerges after the war in 1919. He is pretty much, if you pardon again the pun, rooted to his Art Nouveau designs. So the company is, of course, founded by his equally talented father. So this is Charles Lewis Tiffany. That's where, of course, his name comes from. And he actually won't die until 1902. So that is when Tiffany will eventually inherit the family business. And his company is founded in 1837. He's soon nicknamed the King of Diamonds, as in 1848, taking advantage, in fact, of all of the royal heads toppling across Europe, the year of revolution, he was able to invest in diamonds when they were at a particularly low price. All of the royals were selling their diamonds and the prices were diminished. He acquired around a third of the French crown jewels in 1887, designed special boxes for them, and this is just one example of the type of jewellery that particularly the Empress Eugenie favoured. And he will therefore definitely get a reputation really as a top-notch jeweller. I'm showing you a pair of ruby and diamond bracelets, originally made for the Duchess Angoulême. They were part of this hall of royal jewellery. And then the famous Tiffany diamonds, which was actually discovered in 1877. It's a giant yellow diamond, which Tiffany bought for $18,000, then an unheard of sum, and it's only been worn by 4 women, as it's still in the Tiffany collection. So there's always been a very obvious link between Tiffany and celebrity. So also, like our Liberty, Arthur Lazenby Liberty, Tiffany was very keen to develop his own lines, his own brands. So he will bring in designers like Edward Chandler Moore, and he was designing silver, top quality silver for Tiffany in a modern style. This is the aesthetic movement, dominates American design, really from the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, which is 1876, dominates American design. It's known now as the cult of beauty, and it merges into Art Nouveau in the 1890s. The important thing is the aesthetic movement was very influenced by all things Japanese. And my example here is the carp. So I'm showing you a beautiful silver vase by Edward Chandler Moore, made for Tiffany. And then the amazing piece by Émile Gallet, which is also showing a carp. So it's the sort of Japanese element that we're looking at here. And over it, also again with the goldfish or the carp, we have again this huge influence of Japan. This is something that you must very much bear in mind with Tiffany's own designs, Lewis Comfort Tiffany's own designs, because of course you'll be familiar with all of this work being produced for his father's company. Tiffany had a privileged upbringing. He went to West Point. Perhaps they thought that he might have a career in the military service, but many went to West Point. James McNeill Whistler did as well, the famous American painter. But then he decides from a very early age that that's what he wants to do. He wants to be a painter. And he's initially trained by George Inness and Samuel Coleman. Remember the name Samuel Coleman? He'll come up again later as one of Tiffany's collaborators. Obviously, having money and privilege and position, he's able to travel extensively to Europe and North Africa, particularly in the early 1870s. He's sort of on his own grand tour, sowing his wild oats. We're not sure of the title of the image on the left, though it was definitely painted in North Africa and dates to the early 1870s. And from 1874, the Alhambra in southern Spain, in Andalusia, which was such a huge influence on the artists of the era. So he's influenced on the one hand by Japan and on the other by all things Moorish, which is the name that we normally give to the Islamic art of North Africa and southern Spain. So he really begins his career as an interior decorator. He forms a collaboration with Candace Wheeler, Samuel Coleman, who he trained under, and the wonderfully named Lockwood de Forest, who travelled to India in search of inspiration. They form the Associated American Artists, and they work on a number of projects together. Tiffany is already interested in glass. This is the earliest known experimental piece, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And you can see it's completely abstract, just a load of fantastic swirling colours. And this is going to be the way in which Tiffany will develop as a great interest in the colour and the texture of the glass as in any intrinsic design. Working with Candace Wheeler, they design textiles. So that's a silk fabric down the bottom. And he curated and created the most remarkable home for his family. This was actually commissioned by his father, Charles Tiffany, but Tiffany himself was very much in charge of the project, which was finished around about 1885, and this was Tiffany's studio right at the top of the house. You can perhaps make out all those bizarre hanging lamps, intimations of what will come, because obviously lamps will be very important for Tiffany, particularly in the opening years of the 20th century. So this is thought to be one of his earliest designs for, as you can see, it's not stained glass at all. It's much better to call it leaded glass. And this was for a domestic commission. So just like William Morris, you've got windows made from the outset for both domestic interiors and ecclesiastical ones. Though obviously the ecclesiastical ones really were Tiffany and Morris's bread and butter. And in fact, in the case of William Morris, they were making his windows for churches after his death. This is the eggplant design. And you can see here that what really interests Tiffany is the abstract pattern of the trellis, the hanging fruits, if I can call that, or vegetables, and the different types of glass that he's using to create coloristic effects. So for an interior, the Kemp House in New York. And this is Mark Twain's house, which is in Hartford, Connecticut. Tiffany appears to have worked on this project over a number of years. But this is how it looked, well, say approximately, what was intended by 1881. So the wallpaper, again, is attributed to associated artists. The glass tiles and tile work around the fireplace. Yes, I know you've noticed that the fireplace is under the window. And yes, that is a little odd. It has a down flue rather than a chimney. And please note the window. So now it has these coloured glass, little tiny squares of colour, quarries as we call them, to either side. But we think in fact these originally had much more beautifully painted Tiffany windows, which were sold when Mark Twain had to sell the house in 1902. He might have taken them with him, or they might have been sold, but they certainly are no longer in the house today. So here's another one of this type. This is by Lydia Emmett. And I wanted to emphasize really from the outset that Tiffany is all about collaboration. He works with lots of other artists, many women. Now you can see this in a positive light, that he was giving women a chance at a time when they were establishing their professional identity. You could also see that it was rather exploitative in the case of Clara Driscoll. Some people say that he paid his women less, but in fact Clara Driscoll, who makes the lamps and was the chief female glass cutter, was paid the staggering sum of $10,000 a year. You could buy several cars and several houses for that around 1900. But the important thing is collaboration. Tiffany is just a label, like Morris. There are many artists involved. So this is Lydia Emmett, Beautiful Spring and Autumn, for Samuel Bancroft's home. And he was going to put together the largest collection of pre-Raphaelites in America, and they're still in the collection at Wilmington, Delaware. And these windows were for his private home. I've got a close-up of it here to show you the beautiful painted section of the window, and then the abstract effects of the coloured glass, because he will develop a technology where the glass is decorated internally. In French, this is known as intercaliere. And he'll also develop new technologies for actually mounting the glass, not in lead, but in copper, but more of that in a minute. Other really important commissions associated with this group of artists, the associated artists, so that's Coleman, Lockwood de Forest, Candace Wheeler and Tiffany, are the Park Avenue Armory. This is for the veterans, believe it or not. In case you're wondering what you're looking at there, those things hanging from the ceiling, which have now got LEDs in them, are lamps, believe it or not. And this is often described not as the finest Art Nouveau interior, not the finest aesthetic interior in America, dating around about to 1881, because it is drawing very much on the Orient, on Japan and Islam for its inspiration. It's not easy to get into. You have to sort of wait for an antique fair to get in to see it. It's a very private interior. So I confess I have borrowed these from a recent total renovation scheme. So you can see here what I mean about he was perfectly capable of doing geometric designs here in these early ones. He's already developing textured effects. The plate glass, they're using plate glass. This was like pooled onto sand, okay, the plate glass, and that creates these ripples and other effects. Pilkington pioneered the concept of plate glass, and he's already using opalescent glass, though he did not invent that. One of his rivals, Lafarge, claims to have perfected opalescent glass, a technique also used by Tiffany. These are the opalescent elements here. You add zinc to the metal and that makes it cloudy or milky. But you can see here sort of even Viking elements, can't you, in some of the dragons and what look like Celtic knots down the bottom, all filled with glass. So that's the same interior. The armoury. Tiffany has not fared well in terms of survival of his big projects. So one of the most magnificent was for the White House. They wanted to update this. I think it was also a little bit of patriotism using an American designer. And this was the amazing screen created by Tiffany in 1882, which I'm afraid only lasted 20 years. It was demolished by a later president in 1902. So this is an artistic representation of how it might have looked. We know that Tiffany decorated around about, well, 4 or 5 rooms in the White House for President Arthur. But I'm afraid a later president did not approve at all and went back to the federal style. I wouldn't have minded if he just removed it and given it to somebody, but evidently he didn't. He hated it so much he had it demolished. Okay, look at the light fitting in the centre, because this shows you that as early as 1882, Tiffany is thinking about light fittings. This is from the Havmeyer family home, another magnificent interior, no longer, I'm afraid, extant. So many of these magnificent brownstone mansions in New York were demolished to make way for the 1920s and 1930s skyscrapers. This is one of the lamps from the Havmeyer family mansion. I wanted to show you it being repositioned in a new display at Ann Arbor, Michigan, to give you A, some idea of I wouldn't like that job, and B, also some idea of how big these lamps are. He's acting as my human scale. And here is Louisine Elder Havmeyer. I wanted to include a few of Tiffany's patrons because they are remarkable in their own right. Henry Havmeyer had made his money out of sugar. He had a monopoly on it. He became fabulously wealthy. His wife, however, is even more interesting, Louisine. She was related cousin of Mary Cassatt, the famous French Impressionist. And Louisine formed one of the most important collections of French Impressionism in America, and these are now all in the Met. But she goes unsung because they didn't stick their name all over the Met collection. This is her, a pastel of Louisine by Mary Cassatt. And next to it, a hair ornament designed for Louisine by Tiffany. Please don't ask me how you wore it, but clearly it's a flight of fantasy. Sorry, dragonflies. They all, by the way, love dragonflies. We can get some idea of how rich the interior of the Havmeyer house was, which was obviously in New York, from the elements that have survived and have been split up across a number of collections. So I've already mentioned Ann Arbor, which is in Michigan, but this beautiful window of leaded glass is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. And this is also in Ann Arbor, and is an amazing mosaic for the Havmeyer house. You can see here how he is really experimenting with new types of glass. And he's using the technology of glass mosaic, which goes back to the Byzantine period. You might have been to Ravenna to actually seen those famous mosaics, or those in Venice. But these are glass mosaics. They're not floor mosaics. They're always wall mosaics. And, you know, fantastic array here of different colours and textures, as it has a 3-dimensional quality to it. So although he's at the cutting edge, he is working up against many other innovators in the world of glass. So I've mentioned Lafarge already. You'll see some more glass by him in a minute. We know that he acquires the patent for this new way of edging the glass. So this is one of these experimental pieces. So the copper foil technique means that you, rather than using lead, means that you can work with much smaller pieces of glass. This is why the lamps, this facilitates the lamps. So this new copper foil edging, and the girls who cut the glass, one of their jobs was to apply the edging of copper before the lamps were then put together. The lamps might have 1,000 pieces of glass to make up those elaborate shades. And he will establish his own company in 1885, the Tiffany Glass Company, with showrooms in New York. And I've always got the impression there was a bit of an uneasy relationship now between father and son in terms of the sort of career pattern or career path that Tiffany has chosen. So I've mentioned John Lafarge a couple of times. He was very much a rival, but also a mentor, you know, because one gets the impression that Tiffany learnt from him. They collaborated on projects, particularly in these early years, sort of in the 1880s. Here's again my link to Japan. All of them subscribed to this magazine, Artistic Japan, in French, German, and in English, produced by Samuel Bing. He, of course, is the creator of Art Nouveau. And this was almost like a pattern book for artists. So here's my carp on the front of Artistic Japan, and here's my carp in this wonderful window by John Lafarge of the Fish of 1890, which lives in Boston. It was Lafarge who really perfected the opalescence. In fact, Tiffany and Lafarge went to court over who was, who owned the patents, who had the right to use it. And it is used here to create the watery effect of the fish. So this section here, as you can see, looks rather cloudy. And as you'll see in a minute, this is achieved by using a technique known as plating. He will see the top glass by Lafarge at Paris, 1889. There's the Eiffel Tower. It was built for Paris, 1889. And he will also see here the top glass by Émile Gallet, who stole the show really in 1889 with his famous cameo glass. We also know that Lafarge knew about Japan at first hand. He goes there on a sort of artistic tour in 1886. And I'm showing you a window made by John Lafarge for Lawrence Alma-Tadema, the famous Anglo-Dutch painter. I think that's the best way to describe him. And down the bottom, I've got a close-up of this window that's simply entitled Peonies Blown in the Wind and dates to 1886. So I suppose it's just the luck of history and also Tiffany's acute talent as an entrepreneur that we now always think of Tiffany and not John Lafarge, who was equally pushing glass to new limits in the 1880s and 1890s. So this is also by John Lafarge, which is the theme of butterflies. And you can see again here how you don't need to actually paint the glass anymore at all. You could literally paint with the glass, which is now internally decorated, foiled in copper. You can work at a much smaller scale, which means that you can have a window made up of hundreds of pieces of tiny glass. And this is in the collection in Boston. Tiffany, to really emphasize this, goes a lot further than Lafarge in terms of coming up with new ideas. So this is the Light Bearer, which is in Springfield, Massachusetts. Again, this is a collaboration, and only the hands and, well, the limbs, so the face, the arms and the legs are painted. All the rest is made up of these new types of glass. This is Tiffany's drapery glass. So you can see here how three-dimensional it is. The glass is actually folded and the colour is right the way through the glass. It's not stained, it's coloured all the way through. That's drapery glass. The drapery glass on this window, known as the Resurrection Angel, which I photographed in All Saints, Pasadena, and is said to date to around about 1889, uses not only the drapery glass, I'm showing you a close-up of part of her robe here, the drapery glass here, but also this for her wings, where the glass, as you can see, is manipulated. It's not molded, it's all done by hand, but it is sort of molded into the form of the feathers of her wings. And the rather, as you can see here, soft focus section down the bottom is achieved by plating. Here is plating. So what is plating? It's an ancient technique. It's also used by William Morris. It means that you layer one section of glass over the other. This creates this three-dimensional effect because you can put the opalescence over a coloured piece of glass to create a misty effect. It makes it look as though you've created a sort of perspective in the image. So this is the outside of a Tiffany window. Yes, it rather worries me that it's got no protection at All Saints again, Pasadena. The church itself dates to the 1920s, but the windows are earlier, from the around about 1890 again. But the main thing here is you're looking at the way that you make them. So that's what it looks like from the outside, showing you how the plating works and how thick the glass is, with several layers plated one over the other. And there's the window from the other side. So you create this three-dimensional effect. And again, it'll only be the limbs and the faces that are actually painted. It's just the main panel that's by Tiffany. The two outer ones are slightly later and by a different company. So here it is again, just emphasizing the technology. I really want to put this over, that Tiffany is as much about cutting edge technology as he is about a good design. So here's the plating on the back of the dogwood window, which is in the nets, and here's the other side. And you can see here the texture, the different colours, and he will eventually come up with his own sort of brand name, Favrile, which will originally be applied to his iridescent glass, but in the end becomes something of a brand in its own right, as you'll see in a minute. So here is, in fact, the brand Favrile. This is, I think it's developed in the 1890s, but it comes up with the type of glass, the iridescence. And again, it's not just on the surface, it's not stained, the glass is coloured all the way through. He patents this after his trouble with Lafarge from copyists in 1894. Other companies make iridescent glass. Lutz in Austria is a good example. But the difference is, again, that the Lutz iridescence lies on the surface. You can scratch it off if you really want to try. But here, the iridescence goes the whole way through. And was particularly good for things like peacock feathers, as you can see here, recreating the iridescence of the original. And this will enable him to put on a fantastic display at Paris 1900, where he will take the grand prize. And we believe that he was inspired by oxidized ancient glass. If a piece of glass is buried, the surface oxidizes and turns into something akin to mother of pearl. More of that later in terms of his inspiration. 1893 was another pivotal year for Tiffany, because he will create a magnificent display for the Columbian World's Fair, as in Christopher Columbus, held in Chicago in 1893. This window was made for that. And here's what I mean about using plating and opalescence to create his 3D effects. And as far as I'm aware, not a single brushstroke has touched that window. It's all done by manipulating the coloured glass. In 1892, he will rename his company Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company, perhaps again to encourage more commissions for ecclesiastical work and domestic windows. But most importantly, he will establish his own glass furnaces. They are run for him by Arthur Nash, who he purloined from Stourbridge. He was a British technological wizard, and he was induced by higher wages to join Tiffany and will run the glass furnaces at Corona in Queens, where they will make the glass for the windows and the blown Favrile glass vases, which we'll get to right at the end. So here is the 1893 entrance to the World's Fair. It's again just to give you an idea of how important these international fairs are. I've already mentioned Paris 1889, Paris 1900, but this was the American equivalent, held a few years before to celebrate the discovery of America, obviously Columbian, hence Christopher Columbus in the title. So 1893, he created this amazing chapel, which has had quite an interesting history. It was moved to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, but then reacquired by Tiffany in 1916 and kept in his own home, Laurelton Hall. And then this is the sad tale of Laurelton Hall, which we'll get to in a minute. It's dismantled and sold, but it's been acquired by the Morse Collection, Winter Park, Florida. And they've been gradually buying back bits that were missing until the chapel has been pretty much reconstructed. So the black and white photograph, how it looked originally, that's a font, by the way, with that wonderful stained glass window, again, a trompe l'oeil effect. And here's as it looks today, recreated at Winter Park, Florida, in the Morse Collection. And again, it's to emphasize that lamps were always a really important part of his vision. So there's a very obvious Byzantine Romanesque theme going on here. I do hope we went to Ravenna. This is another of these amazing lamps created for Chicago 1893. This now lives in a church in Boston and was designed by the wonderfully named Jakob Adolphus Holzer. And it's really to, again, really reinforce this idea that collaboration is at the heart of Tiffany's success. That's a close-up. It's just to show you how big the lamp is. And by the way, this church has many windows by Tiffany, which you'll see in just a minute. And then another really important milestone for Tiffany was getting the commission from Samuel Bean to create a series of exemplary windows for Art Nouveau in 1895 when the shop opens. The windows are designed by figures in the French avant-garde, like Xavier Roussel, who designed the garden down the bottom. That's the original cartoon. I don't think the window has survived, but one that has survived, this is Art Nouveau. This is the entrance which you saw earlier, and the shop in the top right-hand corner, sadly again, no longer with us, destroyed. But one of the windows that has survived is this one, which shows a sort of contemporary circus. Au Nouveau Cirque Papa Chrysanthemum was sort of like a cabaret club in Paris. And we're looking at a lady here watching a dancer, perhaps Lorie Fuller, with a wonderful, as you can see, audience of penguins in the background. I love the humour that you get in Art Nouveau. But my close-up, and this, by the way, is in the Musée d'Orsay, really shows you the way in which he's now using coloured and textured glass to its full effect. So really, in his lifetime, his reputation was made by his windows. This is the finest church, I think, in terms of offering you a display from early windows right the way through to almost the end of production, 1930, 16 windows. They are designed by Frederick Wilson, who is the chief designer for Ecclesiastical windows. And as you can see here, they are a tour de force. So we've got the Madonna of the Flowers and the one of the scenes from the Nativity. It's the shepherds. And these are immense pictorial windows. These windows are sometimes 8 or 9 feet high, and they were usually installed to commemorate a loved one. The one at the bottom here, as you can see, 1810 to 1889. That's a replacement, in case you're thinking that's a bit odd down the bottom. It should look like that. Believe it or not, it was vandalized. John the Baptist on one side and the Annunciation on the other, and they are now using confetti glass, iridescent glass, that's the sort of petrol sheeny effect, the drapery glass and the opalescent glass. So all of this tends to get lumped together and simply referred to as Favrile. So some windows obviously meant a great deal to him, and he didn't want to part with them. So these set of 4 made for exhibition purposes. So shown Paris 1900 and Turin in 1902. They will never leave Tiffany's private collection. They will be in his home, Laurelton Hall, until he dies in 1933, and they are now in the Morse collection. This is summer, autumn, and you can see here what the room looked like in which they were displayed. It's a little overwhelming, isn't it, to have so many Tiffany windows set into the internal walls. And the one at the end, I'm afraid, the big figural one, I don't think has survived. But you can see spring and winter. Here's winter, which has survived. So there were certainly some windows that he was so proud of, he never wanted to dispose of them. And as far as I'm aware, these are actually designed by Tiffany himself. So he carries on making windows well into the 20th century. This one's magnolia and irises in the Met. It was a memorial, as you can see, to the Frank family. It has been rescued from the mausoleum because, you know, in Brooklyn, because otherwise either they will get stolen or they will get vandalized. My close-up is showing you how plating is used here to create this milky atmospheric effect. This is really what the opalescent glass was used for, these 3D effects. And the towel autumn landscape window, as late as 1923, still shows you that Tiffany has not lost his touch, but it is also not really paying any attention to the emergence of Art Deco's geometric formulas. I love the water, you know, the effect of the water is fantastic here, cascading through the middle of the window. And equally beautiful for the Battelle Chapel in Norfolk, Connecticut, the Seasons for 1929. Really, the crunch for Tiffany is not so much the war, not even really so much the advent of Art Deco, because Art Deco does not lend itself to this type of pictorial landscape window, which is very naturalistic. What the real problem is the Depression, which of course is the Wall Street collapse at the end of 1929, and that's the reason for his bankruptcy in 1932. There just is not the money for these immense projects like this one. Cities vie for who's got the biggest and the best. So this is 1897, designed, as you can see, by the Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company, using around 30,000 individual pieces of glass. The dome itself is all Tiffany glass, and these pieces are shaped like fish scale. But then the surrounding glass mosaic, which is rather more Renaissance in style, befitting the character of the building in Chicago, which was originally a library, is, as you can see, sort of like adapted to the style of the building, which was Renaissance neoclassical. And this was designed for Philadelphia. It's known as the Dream Garden, and was designed again not by Tiffany but by Maxfield Parrish. Now this is mosaic, so this is mosaic here. So this is another area that Tiffany moves into. This is the surrounding area is glass mosaic, and this is often said to be the finest example of his mosaic work. I mean, there are literally 100,000 tessera of glass, all different types of glass, but particularly the iridescent Favrile. It was originally made for a commercial setting and is now looked after by the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. So Maxfield Parrish is the designer, Tiffany is the fabricator. And this appears to have, this is 1913, and this one's 1915, appears to have inspired this rather beautiful fountain in the Met for the Curtis Publishing Company. Again, it's showing you how he was very much different. He's very much a reliance on the sort of new money that was emerging in America in the early years of the 20th century. So he is supplying commercial spaces as well as ecclesiastical spaces and civic spaces, as in the case of that magnificent library dome. Here's a close-up to show you what I mean about the literally thousands of tesserae that are used to create these windows. I love the swans swimming. However, and as I said, there are always rivals. There's always this is the biggest, this is the best. So this is another contender. This is the proscenium, and I can say this, proscenium curtain of the Placo de la Belle Artes in Mexico City. It goes up and down on a hydraulic system. a gigantic glass curtain, again dating to 1911. So if you think about the Dream Garden around about 1913 and this 1911, really that appears to be the absolute apogee of his inventiveness in terms of design and manufacturing. So with the proceeds of his success, he creates this fabulous house at Laurelton Hall. He appears to bring pretty much his own architect, and again, it combined a lot of features reliant on his glass. There was this amazing loggia on the front of the building, which unfortunately was completely destroyed in 1957, but many pieces were salvaged. Also prior to that, because Tiffany fell completely out of fashion, much had been sold, like that chapel now in the Morse collection in Florida. And I'm also showing you the blossoms of spring, known as Flora Spring, of 1887 to 97, showing you that Tiffany never gave up painting. It was sort of like a hobby for him. But the important thing about this painting is twofold. It includes many of his daughters. He had a big family. He married twice. The wives appear to be rather shadowy. They don't get involved in the business. But his daughters are actually painted in this image. And so he had two wives and he had families from both. And he hoped that his grandson, Lewis Comfort Tiffany II, would take over the company on his demise. But as you know, unfortunately, the company went bankrupt in the early 1930s. My other reason for showing you this is that he had the most lavish parties. I'm not surprised that he didn't go bankrupt before, as he entertained on a truly awesome scale. He would arrange grand masques where he brought these tableaux to life. Girls in Grecian costume, wandering around the gardens of Laurelton Hall, and on one occasion with live peacocks actually on their shoulders. I don't quite know how, ladies, you cope with a live peacock on your shoulder, but it takes feathers in your hat to a new level. Anyway, Laurelton Hall may have been destroyed, but much of it was salvaged. So this was sort of like a conservatory area, sort of extended loggia, where the theme was daffodils. And this has been, to a certain extent, again, as you can see, reconstructed in the Morse collection in Florida. A photograph of how it looked down the bottom and how you'll see it today, and a close-up of the ceramic, in this case, flowers. And Tiffany was very keen on art pottery. I have not included that in this talk, simply from lack of time. But when he went to Paris 1900, he was very taken with the art pottery that he saw and moved into that area in the opening years of the 20th century. Sticking to the glass, here's his dining room. The carpets have been specially rewoven, and this, of course, is the famous wisteria window, of which he made several versions. And that leads very nicely into the last section of my talk, which is really a series of fabulous images of the lamps, and then finally the vases. So this view of Oyster Bay, which is very like the wisteria window of Laurelton Hall, which was Long Island, which was actually made for, again, new money, the Manhattan home of silk industry scion, meaning, you know, impresario William C. Skinner. His home, Holyoke in Massachusetts, was named Wistariahurst. So I presume from that there was a lot of wisteria to be seen. And this, of course, will be adapted into other designs for wisteria windows and, of course, the lamps. So the lamps, the wisteria lamp is not actually designed by Tiffany. It's made possible by this use of the copper rather than lead to bind the individual pieces of glass, which are then, the copper is then darkened to get the effect. And Clara Driscoll, the lady that I mentioned earlier, who was taken on by Tiffany in 1887 and who developed her career to become the chief glass designer and cutter of the female variety, was paid as much as $10,000 a year for her skills. So here are two different views, because of course every lamp is different according to the glass that's used. And most of these lamps were photographed in the New York Historical Society. And Clara Driscoll becomes something of an innovator in her own right, as you'll see in a minute. So, wisteria lamp. That's a wisteria lamp by Gallet, just to show you how different They're both designing at virtually the same time, but that's Gallet's take, using cameo glass on wisteria as opposed to Tiffany's stained glass. And one of the reasons that he goes into making the lamps is that he has a lot of glass left over from making the windows. So this was a very sort of like cost-cutting exercise, don't laugh, in terms of the fact that he had plenty of glass that he could fall back on. And again, we'll use all of the glass that I've mentioned, particularly opalescence and the Favrile iridescent glass as well. So this is the Magnolia lamp. And many of these, of course, were made for electricity right from the outset. This is the trumpet creeper. They vary not only in terms of their coloration, but also in terms of the base that you chose. So from his catalogue, and he had one, you could choose lamp and base. And again, that helps create variety within the genre of the lamp. This one's Peony, and a photograph is in all places in Canberra, yes, capital of Australia, which has got a small selection of Tiffany lamps. And this is again a variant on the base. Peonies, poppies, again different base. So you can see how each lamp can be varied according to colour and base. And this is a new technique developed by Clara Driscoll herself. She would make a filigree template, which was laid over the glass. You don't have to cut it. And this creates this incredibly fine effect, as you can see here in the leaves. So it's like a layer of metal, a metal template put over the glass, which of course is layered. All very clever. Then he'll introduce the so-called turtleback tiles, which are inset into the bases alongside micro mosaics. The theme here is nasturtiums. Monet would have loved that. And then, of course, our favourite ones devised by Clara Driscoll are the drop head dragonfly. So lamps of this order make usually over $1 million. A mosaic work at the bottom, the turtleback tiles set into the bronze, and then the drop head dragonfly lamp again uses Clara Driscoll's idea of a stenciled like template over the top to create the filigree of the dragonfly wings, and then jewels to create a 3D effect in the glass. Here's a close-up. The trouble with choosing what to put into this lecture is what to leave out, because every lamp is magnificent and every lamp is different, as you can see. So again, these are sort of bolder, redder colours coming through, as opposed to sort of bluey green ones. And the most expensive lamps are undoubtedly those that have that element of mosaic included in the base. So here's my sort of fiery red ones, and here's my sort of greeny blue ones. Sorry, they're all so lovely. What do you choose? Here's a close-up of the micro mosaic on the base of one of the lamps. And here it's used to good effect. This is a close-up. That was the close-up. This is the whole lamp, the so-called spiderweb lamp, which again is at top dollar. And the lamps were expensive. They could be the equivalent of the cost of a car, a Ford, car, $200 or $300 at the time. So at this level, it most certainly was not art for the people, but of course it was a sliding scale. Animals are not common. It's a bit fuzzy, but I photographed this in Canberra. Fish would have been inspired by some of his earlier windows. And in terms of animals, well, of course, one of my favourite things throughout, the peacock feather. And then finally, the one that tends to get, I'm afraid, reproduced very often are these bronze table lamps with the iridescent tubes of glass. So one of Tiffany's problems is there was a lot of imitation at the time and a lot of imitation in shell today. I love the peacock feathers on the base of the lamp. Right, so just the last little section, vases. Now I think the vases, the Favrile vases, was an area that Tiffany was particularly proud of. I think this is where he could really innovate. And he was innovating in this area, particularly in the period up to the First World War. This is a reconstruction again of what the vases would have looked like in his conservatory at Laurelton Hall. Rather Islamic, as you can see, in terms of its design inspiration, harking back to the Alhambra, and how the vases are arranged in the photograph has been reprised, as you can see, in the display. So to emphasize that he was not the inventor of iridescence, but he perfects it. And my favorites are the Jack in the Pulpit vases, which you can't do anything with them, can you? They're purely for show. And the beautiful blue iridescent one is in MoMA. And this is the technique on the left-hand side here is known as dragging. I also think it looks like feathering. So he will experiment with just this sort of petrol iridescence, like the sheen of a peacock feather, but he'll also experiment with different shapes. So again, emphasizing the Islamic influences on Tiffany, very important also for glass technology. These are original Islamic sprinkler vases, the real thing, and that's Tiffany's take on them, but now in his iridescent Favrile glass. I've mentioned fakes and forgeries. They were prevalent at the time, and they're certainly prevalent now. So this is what I mean by the feathering effect in the iridescence. And there I'm showing you that the genuine pieces have a pontile mark because they're all blown, and some which are ground down, which are genuine, will have a paper label. The chances of you finding one of these at an antique fair or a car boot are, I think, slim. You're much more likely to get the fakes and the forgeries. Anyway, to finish, the feathering effect, or dragging as it's sometimes called, two examples here from the Met. One where it really just looked like a peacock's feather with an eye, and the other where it's more abstract in terms of the dragging, and I'm showing you the extremes of colour. The theme here is leaves. So these are stylized, very Art Nouveau leaf motifs, and the bold red one in the middle is in the V&A collection. The 1890s vase, which is like just a floral form in its own right, is very much in the height of Art Nouveau styling. Then, as I said, he really feels, I think, that it's in the vases that he can experiment with new ideas. So he comes up with Cipriotti, which is where you roll the vase in powdered glass to try and get the effect of a piece of glass that's been buried. And then the other technique that fascinated him was free-flowing glass, the lava glass, as you can see here, again, using the Favrile iridescence. And he will give a collection of these to the Met in the 1920s. And I think he really felt that this was his big contribution, these new technologies of Cipriotti and lava glass. Again, the beautiful bowl, the lava glass piece on the left here, and the Cipriotti down the bottom, where you can see where it's been rolled in the glass powder and then vitrified, creating all sorts of like textures and bubbles and, well, just, you know, really like lava. And then finally, and I haven't gone through all the techniques that he experimented with, but another idea that fascinated him was paperweight vases. So here you've got, as you can see, it's almost like a cane in the center of the flower, and this is the paperweight vase in all its glory. So it's like capturing layers of glass. Again, there's a three-dimensional effect. But I do think it was very much the vases that he felt was where he could really push glass to the limit. So it's not surprising that Joseph Briggs, who will join Tiffany in 1893 as a young man, at Quinton born, originally starts in the calico industry as an engraver. He will join Tiffany's in a very amusing and romantic manner. He tried to get a job there, got refused. He was persistent. He stalked Lewis Comfort Tiffany. On one occasion, he saw him coming from his car into the office, and he sheltered him under an umbrella, believe it or not. And Tiffany was so impressed by Briggs's persistence and ingenuity that was how he got his job, an umbrella. In the end, Briggs will be pretty much in control of the entire enterprise, which at the height of its effectiveness employed over 540 people, artists, designers, glass blowers, cutters, mosaicists, and chemists. And of course, when Tiffany is declared bankrupt, a lot of it is simply thrown away. I wish I'd been there. But Briggs, realizing that the tide might turn, kept a private collection, but then sent 140 pieces of Tiffany to his hometown of Accrington in Lancashire. A view of them on one of the shelves, a lava piece down the bottom, here's 114, and then an iridescent piece down the bottom. And the Jack in the Pulpit vase is also in Accrington. They've had to buy a lamp, didn't have one. Briggs very much concentrated on the vases. There are also a couple of mosaics there as well. One of the white cockatoos being particularly beautiful. But I think from a pride point of view, that Briggs thought the vases were at the very, again, pardon the pun, cutting edge of glass technology. And also it would have been very difficult to have actually sent sort of really large things like stained glass windows. So I leave you with my last rather sad slide, which is at Laurelton Hall after it's been destroyed by fire in 1957. Tiffany found it very hard to adapt to Art Deco, unlike René Lalique, who does not die until 1945, but was able to make the quantum leap from Art Nouveau floral to Art Deco geometric. There was also the problem of the Depression, and all of these things combined, the move to modernism, which didn't like ornaments, and the loss of wealthy patrons leads to his bankruptcy in 1932. And so that is the end of Lewis Comfort Tiffany. But of course, the jewellery side of the business as a brand still thrives. So as you know, William Morris has been revived by Sanderson. Lalique is still going strong. And Lewis Comfort Tiffany's enterprises may have come to an end. But the jewellery side of the business is still one of the world's leading brands. And thank God, a lot of this was salvaged either for Morse, the collection in Florida, or for the collection in New York in the Metropolitan Museum of Art.